So biochar, it sounds almost too good to be true. You can take plant material, heat it up without oxygen, and then the charcoal you get back can lock that kind of carbon in soils for hundreds of years, and it also reduces greenhouse emissions. So if a 14-year-old or a teenager asked you what the catch is, or how would you describe that whole process, what would you say?
Yeah, so I love this question. I give a talk where I have a slide. I say all those things about biochar that you just said, and then I have a slide, but can we have our cake and eat it too? And the answer is not quite, not all at the same time. So frequently with biochar, you can realize a few of the benefits at the same time and not all of them necessarily. So in addition to the stuff you just said, you can boost many aspects of soil quality, like soil water retention and nutrient retention and pH, but you don't usually see all of those at once. And then because you have to match the biochars to the soil. So some biochars have different, like I use the term biochars plural because there are thousands, possibly millions, or even infinite numbers of biochars you could possibly make because there's many different materials that you can make them from and many different temperatures and other pyrolysis conditions, like the speed of pyrolysis, how long you hold it at the high temperature. I think you said heating up without oxygen, that's the pyrolysis. And and when you adjust all those things, you can come up with many biochars, and not all biochars are compatible with all soils. The carbon benefit is usually realized. However, like the persistence of the carbon in the biochar is usually realized in that, yes, it will persist to hundreds of thousands of years. But the problem is the actual net carbon sequestration also depends on how you were growing the crops. So if you grew the crops in a very energy intensive way using lots of fertilizers, if you were transporting the crop, like the waste part of the material, whatever part you intend to pyrolyze, if you transport that feedstock a long way, or you transport the biochar a long distance, more than 30 miles is the really ballpark number people like to use, then you're not going to see the climate benefits anymore, or just not as much, depending on what's going on. First, you have to match the biochar to the soil. And second, you have to avoid some of these pitfalls like energy intensive production or transportation.
Yeah, so I was reading a little on your dissertation and your 2019 paper. They both looked at how biochar affects CO2 and N2O emissions from the soil. So what did you really find? Does it reliably reduce the greenhouse gases, or is it a little more complicated and
So
nuanced?
that's one of the really complicated effects where you don't always realize all the benefits at once. So it's way easier to realize the increased pH benefit. That's a really easy one. You find an acidic soil, you add alkaline biochar, you increase the pH. Increasing nutrient retention is a little iffier, and same thing with water retention. It depends on the texture of the soil and the like initial nutrient holding capacity of the soil. And then we think something similar is going on with the greenhouse gas emissions, where it depends on what the properties of the soil are to begin with. A lot of those greenhouse gases are coming from, if it's a nitrogen gas like nitrous oxide, those gases are coming from nitrogen fertilizer in the soil. And you have this kind of catch 22 because you want to hold on onto the nitrogen in the soil as much as you can. But the more nitrogen there is in the soil, the more it could possibly become nitrous oxide. The microbes will transform it depending on how much moisture there is. Likewise, if you want to hold on to moisture in the soil, the more moisture there is in the soil, the more nitrous oxide and potentially methane emissions you could have. So there's a trade-off between greenhouse gas emissions and these other benefits, nutrient and water retention. And in some soils, you might see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and in other soils, you might see no effect or even a slight increase, again, depending on what the initial properties are of the soil.
Yeah, so I've read a very small number of biochar studies. They focus on arid land. So you're working in Tucson, which is very dry, one of the driest environments of the US. So why does that gap there matter? And does biochar behave differently in dry soil than in wet soil?
When we say dry and wet soil, we have to back up and talk about dry versus wet climate because if the soil is wet versus dry, that's going to affect how it behaves that day. But if the soil is receiving lots of precipitation over time, you're going to end up with a more acidic soil, lower in nutrients. However, in when it's receiving very low amounts of precipitation, you get the opposite, an alkaline soil that has accumulations of salts, including some nutrients, not nitrogen, but sulfur and calcium frequently will accumulate there. And the saltiness is that there's different challenges with these soils. So the soils developing in wet environments like in a forest, those will be acidic and you want to add an alkaline biochar. If you have a soil in a desert, now that soil is already alkaline. You do not want to add alkaline biochar. You want to add neutral or acidic biochar first. Secondly, the desert soils tend to have high salt concentrations, which are bad for plants. So you want to add a low salt biochar in addition. And so you achieve that by pyrolyzing it at a lower temperature, and you also start with a feedstock that is lower in salts compared with elsewhere. And then, oh, obviously, if you don't get much water in the desert, you want to conserve water, and so you want to choose a porous that holds on to lots of water. This is where we run into a catch-22 because the most porous chars tend to be a little saltier. They tend to be like the leaves of plants. So you have to find a plant that's leafy where you can collect just the leaves and that doesn't accumulate too much salts, which is tricky. Or you can go in the middle. So there's hardwood, softwood, and herbaceous, so leafy feedstocks. And if you go on the leafy end, you have high water holding capacity. On the hardwood end, you have low water holding capacity, but more higher carbon concentration, so more storage of carbon in the soil. In the middle, you have the softwoods. They're still pretty porous, but they're lower in salts usually. Yeah, I can send you, I have multiple recordings with that information all laid out in a nice slide.
Yeah, I'll send you an email afterwards. I
Okay.
typically do that. So I was looking into your research. You also research how to teach this to introductory students, people encountering soil and soil science for the very first time. What's the biggest misconception students walk in with about how soil and what is soil, what it actually is?
It's almost a worldview and not a misconception. It's that soil is just dirt. And so, what I teach in the very first lesson is that soil provides ecosystem services, things to support life on Earth, from not just the ability to support plant growth, which is what everybody thinks about, but the ability to hold on to water and filter water, and the ability to regulate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, just and generally the concentration in the atmosphere. We don't want too much, we don't want too little in the middle. And soil really helps with that. A lot of the other misconceptions are really technical and not ones that the public hold. It's ones that are in like science majors. But the one misconception that the public tends to hold, besides the soil just being just dirt, is that tropical soils are fertile, but they're actually really infertile. So people see all the plants growing in the tropics and be like, oh, that soil must be really fertile. But in reality, it's been rained on for thousands of years. And with the high temperatures experienced in the tropics combined with the rain, that soil has been weathered down. So the nutrients leach out of the soil, like they get broken down from the rocks and then leach out of the soil profile. And those soils are not very fertile, and the plants are growing well despite the lack of soil fertility because A, there's plenty of light and water there to compensate. And B, as soon as they drop their leaves or any plants die, the microbes can grow way faster than anywhere else there. And because of that heat and moisture, and they can cycle the nutrients right back to the plants. So I like to think of it as having very little money in the bank, but always getting enough each month to keep living. Where the money in the bank is the nutrients in the soil.
Yeah, so I interviewed last week a man named Gabe Brown, who's a regenerative rancher in North Dakota. He talked a lot about soil health, recover crops, no-till, and livestock integration. So how does biochar fit into that world? Is it complementary or is it really a different approach?
It's very complementary. It's different in that it's a soil amendment that lasts hundreds of thousands of years in the soil, but it's generally complementary in that you can apply biochar together with the manure from a combined like integrated agriculture system with both animals and plants being grown, where you're putting the manure from the animals onto the soil, right? You could just mix that with biochar, and that reduces the emissions from the manure. That's way more consistent than reducing emissions from average just soil, period. And then the and it reduces nutrient losses and all that stuff. So you can integrate biochar into systems that are already using manure or compost. And if you have a mulching scenario, even if it's like just crimping the old crop to kill it and just leaving some plant residue on there, that protects the biochar and keeps it from being blown away. The problem with the no-till situation, no-till approaches, which are great in general for sustainability, is that unfortunately biochar has such a low density that if you just try to put it on top of the soil, it easily gets blown away. And most of the time we recommend tilling it in, which is unfortunately going to release a bunch of carbon in that tilling process. And a lot of people have tried to get around this by injecting biochar water slurries or biochar like fertilizer slurries, biochar manure slurries into the ground, mixing the biochar with compost so that it's a little more moist and sticky and it doesn't blow away so easily. But yeah, co-application of biochar with something else can theoretically enable success in a no-till situation. I just haven't researched that myself. So I know that it can work, but there's not enough information that I know of to predict when exactly it will work well.
Yeah.
So we have to like just collectively, scientists researching biochar, especially the soil aspects, are trying to come up with a decision tree type diagram resource that will help farmers select what type of soil they have, what kind of practices they're using, and from there it can suggest some of the best biochar options.
Yeah, so some people and scientists pitch biochar as like a climate solution at scale with offset programs, carbon credits, and industrial production. And other people say it really only works in specific contexts. Where do you stand on that?
I say it's definitely context specific. I wouldn't call it niche exactly. Like it's not, it can work in a lot of contexts, just not all contexts. So I think that means I stand somewhere in between those two extremes. It's I explain. I would not call biochar a silver bullet, and my recording that I'll send you explains that. It can solve a lot of problems, but there's many cases where the problem will be better solved by something else. Out here in the desert, boosting moisture, it's some of the first things you need to do are like apply some kind of mulch or something like that to protect the surface of the soil. And those things can be more effective than biochar, but you can also combine them with biochar. Secondly, the transportation issue is pretty serious. So biochar is only sustainable within certain radii of where you have the feedstock. And right now we do still have carbon credits, miraculously. Those haven't been dismantled. But the biochar's economic viability does, especially when trying to scale it up, does depend on carbon credits. So one of the limitations is actually economic and not climate related. But yeah, on the climate end, it's mostly the feedstocks that you need aren't necessarily near the soils that need them, which is especially prominent in the deserts because it's hard to find low salt plants out here to make biochar from. And it's hard to collect them. There's buffalo grass out here. It's invasive. We'd love to turn it into biochar, but it is so hard to harvest.
Yeah, so on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the most urgent, how urgent would you say the soil health crisis is in the US? And this could be climate, agriculture, you can.
And in terms of just soil health by itself, soil operates on a thousands of year time scale. So we have a lot of time to fix the problem. It's extremely important, but it's not as urgent as climate changes. Now, there's a lot of soil management techniques that help with climate, and those are urgent to adopt.
Yeah. So for a teenager who's never really heard of or touched soil science, what's one thing that they could do or read or do something that this week or another week or whenever they're seeing something like this that would change how they see the ground and under their feet?
That's a really good question. So, a really simple thing is to just dig a hole, spread out the soil, and look for organisms. There's more than you think in there. Now, you might not see as many in certain like urban areas. And for fun, you could look up, there's a lot of at-home soil tests, soil texture by feel. There's also maps like showing where the carbon is in the soil and lots of other kind of fun hands-on things that you can look up how to do. And yeah, I'd say that's it, but imagine I'll come up with something else later. Yeah.
Yeah, so can you give me a few names of who I should interview next? They can be soil scientists, biochar researchers, anyone who you think would be an interesting person for me to interview in the field of environmental science.
And in my department, you could try Joey Blankenship. He's a soil health expert. Debunker Sanyal is also a health expert. So I wouldn't interview both. I'd just pick one. They both have a lot to say. And then for environmental science, Monica Ramirez Andriata does a lot of outreach. She loves this stuff, so I'm sure she'd be happy to give a spiel. And she has citizen science research going on, so
Yeah.
you could talk about that.
Yeah, I'll send you an email with a bunch of stuff. Thank you after. But I have one more question, and I really like to ask this question. I've asked it basically every interview, and it's if you had one sentence to say to the next generation, what would it be?
Oh, people like to say, be the change you want to see in the world. And I want to take it a step further and also say, even if things look really grim right now, the world actually changes slowly. So you actually have more power than you think. There have been lots of revolutions before. There's been like civil unrest. Change has happened in this country, and individuals are not powerless to stop it. If whatever, for whatever you believe in, climate change, social justice, speak up. Your voice actually does matter. In terms of advice, one of the keys to making change is to finding other people who want to see the change that you want to see and forming a network and putting down roots.